All right, welcome everyone back to Massconversions. Today we have with us Father David Nix. He's a Catholic priest born in Denver, Colorado. Welcome, Father, for joining us today.
Thanks for having
just
me.
A little bit of his bio is he graduated Boston College in 2000, worked as an EMT, and then later was ordained in 2010. And he's done a lot of mission trips, including in North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, where he's working a lot to end abortion and child trafficking. He's now a diocesan hermit, a monk missionary with apostolates approved and a rule of life under Canon 603. And he chose this pathway several years ago while deciding to offer exclusively the 7 ancient Roman sacraments, especially the traditional Latin Mass. You can search for him anywhere on the internet, on any of the social media platforms under Padre Peregrino. And we'll begin us off with prayer, please, Father.
Okay, in nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen.
Amen. All right. Thanks again, Father, for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So our first question here for you is, you've been a priest for about 15 years, if I have that right, and about halfway through, you decided to switch solely to the Tridentine Mass. If you can explain, kind of the reason why and what drew you.
Yes. Well, there was the good and the bad. I always usually start my podcast with the bad. The bad was that there's really no diocese in the United States that's going to allow a priest to follow the hermeneutic of continuity. I had 5 Novus Ordo parishes in 5 years, and they tried sending me to relatively conservative pastors. So, we're seen as sort of a conservative diocese, conservative bishops, sent me to conservative pastors, and really no place was as conservative as me. Now, your listeners are probably thinking, well, that's because you're an extreme traditionalist. But I really wasn't an extreme traditionalist back then. The book I was quoting, or rather the document I was quoting, trying to do the Novus Ordo the right way, was Redemptionis Sacramentum, which was written by Cardinal Rinzi, 2004, signed by Pope John Paul II. And it's really all the rules of the post-Vatican II Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass, written, again, this wasn't written in 1504, it was written in 2004. And you're going to be very, very hard-pressed to find a single parish in any state in the United States, coast to coast. This isn't just me, being bitter about my hometown. You will not really find a Novus Ordo parish coast to coast that follows all the rules written for the Novus Ordo Mass in Redemptionis Sacramentum. Maybe a couple tiny Opus Dei chapels you might find the Novus Ordo done according to its own rules. But for me, it was a matter first, and we're still on the negative here, of fear of losing my soul, that I was having too many arguments and fights with Eucharistic ministers about their carelessness, and then the pastors didn't really know how to land on it because they didn't want to sacrilege the Eucharist, but they also didn't want to get rid of these old ladies who've been Eucharistic ministers for 20 years. So there was really no place for me. And when I really realized there was no place for me, kind of my mild interest in the traditional sacraments, not just the Mass, but my mild interest kind of peaked. And then I started falling in love with the old sacraments, the traditional Latin Mass, the old extreme unction, the old rites of baptism with all the exorcisms. And then, in other words, just like most things in life, it's suffering that brings you to change. And so it was suffering of not finding a hermeneutic of continuity anywhere that I found tradition. And then I found many, many great things about tradition. One of the many great things about it is there's no real wiggle room for ad-libbing because, 1, the old sacraments are in Latin, and 2, if you read the rubrics, there's really not a lot of room for ad-lib even in the rubrics. You just do what's been handed by Christ to the apostles, to all the popes and the saints. And so maybe it's my German-Irish background, maybe it's the fact that I just always wanted to be, if I was going to be a Catholic priest, do it the right way, the apostolic way, the traditional way. But there's no room for there's no room for arguments with pastors or Eucharistic ministers, as long as you're doing the old rite. So people think I'm pretty controversial, but I'm actually very conflict averse. I don't like fighting, and switching to the old Mass kept a lot of fights out of my life.
That's good. That's good. Now you mentioned something to me that kind of leads to the second question was about you don't like to use. I don't know if you don't like to use, but you don't prefer to use traditional Catholic. You like to use Apostolic Catholic.
I usually say apostolic, and it's not because I think I'm better than traditional Catholics. It's not because I really have a big problem with it. It's because many conservative Novus Ordoites, I often call them neocon non-trads, they like to pigeonhole us into, they say, oh, well, you traditionalists, you want to live in like a time warp to the 1940s or a time warp to the 1880s or whatever. And the more and more I study, the more and more I realize that this whole theory of antiquarianism that I think it was Pope Pius XII wrote against, or maybe it was Pius XI, antiquarianism was this notion that Pope Pius XI or XII really saw coming down the pike, even before Vatican II, that certain reformers within the church, we're not just talking Protestants, but this did happen with Cromwell, Luther, all the guys 500 years ago. But anyway, antiquarianism is this notion that if you just study the early church hard enough, you're going to find essentially the Novus Ordo. And that's what I was taught in my Novus Ordo seminary. Like, that's fine if there's some traditionalists that like the traditional Latin Mass from the 15th century and 16th century, but the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, is really older than the old Mass.
That's
well,
interesting.
nowadays I say, well, that doesn't even make sense in English, right? But even before we get to the theology, how can you say the old Mass is, or the new Mass is older than the old Mass? But one of the things I've discovered is, I almost want to say Pope Pius XI didn't even have reason to fear antiquarianism, because the more and more we study, the more and more we find that, for example, I wrote an article about this a year ago, and John Henry Weston was so shocked at this, he had me on just to talk about this. But I got it right from the Council of Trent, that the Council of Trent states that the Roman canon, what Novus Ordoites out there called Eucharistic Prayer 1, the Roman canon was given by Christ to the apostles. That's a big showstopper for people. Now people say, oh, you think they were speaking Latin? No, 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 they weren't speaking Latin. Obviously there was a bunch of saints missing in the first century that they added into the Roman canon in the second, third century. But once we sideline the easy objections, like that we know the Roman canon was not first in Latin, we know a bunch of saints were written, it's pretty shocking that the bare bones of Eucharistic Prayer 1, the bare bones of the Roman canon, were given, according to the Council of Trent, by Christ to the apostles. So that right there blows out of the water even fear of antiquarianism, this whole notion that the new Mass is older than the old Mass. We have proof from the Council of Trent that the Roman canon was essentially, at least in its bare bones structure, given from Christ to the apostles.
That's true. That's true. And it's interesting how so many Catholics don't understand that, because, like I talked to some Catholics just, right after Mass and say, isn't it, it's a beautiful gift. And we get talking about the Mass and they say, well, I wonder when this came in, or I wonder when this came in. And we start talking about how some stuff was just handed in, by Christ to the apostles. And they're like, do you really think that happened? And I'm like, yeah, it did.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
it's shocking. They're like, no way, it can't really go that far back, can it?
Well, and this is sorry, I didn't answer your question. That's why I call it Apostolic Catholicism, because I really am convinced how old this stuff is. I'll give you one other quick example. So my sister's a Byzantine Catholic, and I've watched many of my nieces and my nephew get baptized in the Eastern Rite. They have all the same exorcisms that I do in the ancient Roman Rite. Anytime you have major overlap between things that were very geographically different, like rites that are found in the Far East, maybe not the Far East, but like the east of the Mediterranean that Byzantine Catholics do, and there's overlap with what a traditional Roman priest like me does. Anytime, and Father Ripperger's talked about this before in his book on the liturgy, when there's that much overlap, you can be pretty sure it's apostolic in origin. So when people say, yeah, maybe some superstitious Catholics added the exorcisms before baptism in the 12th century because everyone was superstitious and afraid in the Middle Ages. No. If every rite, if every Eastern Catholic rite and every traditional rite in the Catholic Church had exorcisms, you can be really sure Christ wanted the apostles to have those exorcisms over babies before the baptism. So do you kind of see why I like to call it
Yeah,
apostolic
that makes perfect
Catholicism?
sense.
Because I'm
Yeah.
really convinced this goes way, 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 way back.
Yeah, I mean, if we have the apostolic, succession of the bishops, why not have the tradition passed down of
Yeah.
what did they do and how did they pray? It's one priest put it that Christ Himself showed us how God wants to be worshipped,
Yes,
and
right.
so the Mass is. So,
Hmm.
so yeah, no, I love how you call it apostolic because it really brings it back home to what it is. So that's wonderful. So question 3 is in regards to the missal you use for a Mass. A lot of different priests and people talk about it, especially these days. And I think I saw on one of your posts that you do the pre-1955 missal, if that's correct?
Yes, behind me is my altar. You can't see it because I have these room dividers up, but behind me is my altar, and on that altar, I have a 1939 missal. And
Oh,
I don't know why that's really controversial for people. I think people get anxious about it
mm-hmm.
because I think they think it starts to question the authority of the church. I'm not a 58 sedevacanist. I have friends who are. I think a lot of them do use a pre-55 a missal, but there's many people who are seen as pretty mainstream traditionalists, like Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who's a huge fan of the pre-55, and he's the farthest thing from a sedevacantist out there. And so, in fact, he has a new book coming out on the pre-55 liturgy. Now, the Roman canon I have a 1939 missal right behind me.
Mm-hmm.
The 1939 missal is going to be in 99% of the pages the same as the 1962 missal that I have in my bedroom on a bookshelf that I used to use before I switched to the 1939 missal. And so it's really not a huge controversy if 99% of the 39 missal I have and the 62 missal all line up. The big thing that I like in my 1939 missal is in the back of it, there are many Marian feast days that were already starting to get taken out before Vatican II by Bunini. And so Bunini is the big question on this. I don't think we really have to get into debates on papal validity. Well, people can if they want, but even Dr. Taylor Marshall, who, again, not a 1958 sedevacantist, if you look at infiltration, he proves very clearly in there that Bunini was a Freemason. And so for me, it's like anybody that's a Freemason, I just don't want his little fingers in the missal that I'm using. Of course, I'm not questioning the validity of a traditional Latin Mass done with the 1962 missal. I don't even really question the validity of the Novus Ordo. I do think the Novus Ordo is actually a valid Mass. So this isn't a question of validity. It's a question of what you mentioned 10 minutes ago. What is the best way to worship God? And I like the missal behind me that hasn't been dialed down in all the Marian feast days. I like the missal behind me that has a lot more octaves if I want to do those than what Bunini got his little mitts on.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And I think it's Archbishop Vigano himself. He talked about he was encouraging, I think it was, I don't know, last year or maybe 2 years ago now, that going back to the 1955 missal preserves some of the ancient Eastern liturgies that we've lost, that Bonini decided to, chop away and basically destroy the Easter ceremony. So it's kind of
Easter,
interesting.
not Eastern, but Easter.
Easter, yeah.
Oh, that's true. Absolutely. Well, that's exactly right, because the very first thing that Bunini took a hatchet to was Holy Week. So that's exactly right. If you go to, what's ironic is Institute of Christ the King will keep a pre-55 Holy Week in a lot of places, and SSPX will not. So a lot of people who are new to tradition are very, very surprised, because they're going to think, well, SSPX seems farther to the right than Institute of Christ the King, but I don't think you're going to find a single SSPX parish in the entire world that does the pre-55 Holy Week, but you will find quite a few Institute of Christ the King parishes that quietly, I guess we can say, do that. They do the pre-55, and it's beautiful. I mean, there are a lot of changes. I try to get, if I do my own low Mass, I will try to get to like the FSSP in town that does the pre-55 Holy Week, because it's just the most beautiful thing all year. It really is.
It is. I've experienced it myself, and it's out of this. It's totally bringing heaven to you for sure.
Yeah,
in the sense
it
of
is exactly
through Holy Week. It's amazing, and I guess that leads us right into the third question here, or fourth question, about I saw a post that you put on, I think it was Substack, how you went to the Holy Land recently, and you offered Mass with a Palestinian Roman Missal from, I think, in 1855 or 1850, something like that.
Middle of the 19th century, yes.
Yeah, so how was that experience? Explain that to our audience. So this is going back even to an
Yeah.
older missal, and just, you know, what was the continuity there and the experience? And
Yeah, I found an old missal from the 1850s in Jerusalem. I lived right in the old city Jerusalem, so right in the heart of Jerusalem with the Lebanese. And not only did the Lebanese do the Marian rite, unfortunately, they do all the new Marian rite. So that's why there's two reasons I was surprised to find a very ancient Roman missal in there. One, because the Lebanese are very, quote unquote, obedient to everything that happened in the changes in the Maronite. And secondly, even if it were before Vatican II, I'd be surprised to find a Roman rite because the Lebanese follow a Maronite. Now, they were very, very hospitable to me. There was beautiful statues of Saint Charbel everywhere. So I'm not ripping on them liturgically. Very beautiful, welcoming, amazing people that had me stay there for a month. But I was still surprised to find a 1850s missal. And so when I brought it to their altar to do my own low mass every day, I was a little intimidated at first because I thought, okay, I'm confident enough the Latin probably didn't change a lot from 1850 to 1950, but I didn't know about the tassels and the tabs, and maybe like the propers were going to be in different locations. And I was right on a couple of these guesses. Like some of the propers kind of punt to the commons in the 1850s, a little bit more than the 1950s. And some of the tassels were almost turning to dust because this book had been around 150 years. But really, after I got over like some of the tassel physical problems, and then, like I said, some of the propers punting to the commons, and I just had to go over that for like 10 minutes before Mass, I was offering Mass just fine with an 1850s missal. And so what that once again shows you is if there were minimal, just the tiniest changes possible from 1850 to 1950, you can pretty much presume that was the case from 1750 to 1850. And you can guess where I'm going, 1650 to 1750, 15, all the way back, right?
Sure.
And so it just really does prove the real hermeneutic of continuity is for it's over 19 centuries. And anyone who wants to deny the current hermeneutic of rupture, well, it's crazy because even the current Vatican admits there's a hermeneutic of rupture. So, I think we just have to be honest. This isn't even a matter of theology. It's a matter of honesty on what has really changed and what really brought us back to what was ancient.
Mm-hmm. So, and what really was, the Mass before, all the changes too. It's been a huge, they call it the liturgical time bomb that went off. And it's true. I had a grandpa who went to Mass every day, and then as soon as the Novus Ordo came, he goes, "That's not the Mass. I don't know what it is, but it's not the Mass." And he left Catholicism. Yes. Right when the changes came. So
it's so sad. We were taught all the bad Catholics left in the 60s, and I was talking to my friend Liz Yor a few nights ago, and I asked her. She told me about her dad who left. He ended up coming back to the church, but he left right at Vatican II, and that's the same story with the priests. We were told all the worst priests left in the 1960s and the 1970s. But what we keep finding is a lot of the religious orders, it was their very best men who wouldn't take their cassocks off and put on, Hawaiian shirts or whatever they started to wear in the 70s. It was a lot of the religious orders' very best priests who continued with the old sacraments, continued with the old Mass, continued wearing the cassock that were kicked out of their orders. Now, they would, of course, use different words than "we kicked you out." They'd find some red herring to hang them on. But it's surprising that it seems like the very worst priests left in the 70s and the very best priests left in the 70s.
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad what happened.
And even if they didn't leave the priesthood and go and marry a nun like the liberals, they may have had to go independent in the 1970s.
Yeah, I know some good independent priests, some in California, some in Pennsylvania, that they some of them just never even stopped. They just kept going.
That's right. California was famous for that. There were some very good, holy, independent priests out there who they just kept going. They weren't going to stop just because Catholicism was no longer welcome in certain dioceses in California. God bless those priests.
Yeah, God bless them for sure. So speaking about theology now, you wrote here. I'll just quote this little because I think the way that you worded it was really amazing. You said in one of your recent Substack articles, "For 1,000 years, the catechesis happened by kneeling at Holy Mass. I do not mean that Mass is enough to catechize ourselves. I mean that serious Catholics learned and prayed during the week as best he could. Then on Sundays, everything he learned or offered was forged in a mysterious and powerful ritual that incorporated all his senses, his intellect, and his will." Could you explain that a little bit? What you were talking about there in the article?
Yes. Well, I was talking to a friend the other day. You've probably seen his channel called Catholic Esquire, and we were talking about Chartres. I think it was Chartres or one of the cathedrals in France, where when you go there, how much of catechesis of all of salvation history is actually on the walls of these cathedrals. And so nowadays, I mentioned like Scott Hahn books in that article, and I have no problem with Scott Hahn books. They're very helpful. But like I didn't mention his salvation history. Let me just mention salvation history. He has a bunch of books on salvation history, and he's done a very good job at it. And places like Franciscan University of Steubenville really have studies for the cream of the crop of Catholics who want to study salvation history. Well, what did that look like in 13th century France? Who got to learn salvation history? The people whose parents could afford the top university, University of Paris at the time? No. Uneducated, illiterate peasants who stepped into the Cathedral of Chartres could look up and see the stories in mosaics and sculptures and drawings, all of Old Testament and New Testament salvation history, right? And so this is a little bit off topic of what you're talking about. I'm going to bring it back to that. But I think the point I was making in that article is that the churches and the movements and the rituals and the incense and the kneeling and the standing, all the things that comedians make fun of Catholics for all the time, all those things got baked into your heart and brain, your body, your soul, because Catholicism is so incarnational, at least traditional Catholicism, at least Apostolic Catholicism, it's so incarnational that you didn't have to have a degree from out where you are, like at Christendom, a good university, but you didn't have to do that because you learned by kneeling at the altar rail, by being blessed with the Son of God in the hands of a priest, that you better be ready to receive him if you're actually going to kneel down and be blessed by the Son of God before communicating with him. And so the point of that article was to show that God made real education to be full body experiences, not just purely intellectual. That's why I think I titled that article.
Isn't it St. Thomas Aquinas? He said, we learn everything from the senses.
From the senses, exactly. And I love good books. I think it's great to learn. St. Paul says faith comes through hearing. So we do want to use our eyes in reading. We do want to use our ears in listening. But we also have another three senses God has made to catechize us with. And to be honest, the 7 old sacraments catechize through all 5 sacraments every day, all day long, all 7 sacraments, 1,000 times better than the new sacraments, which are ironically catechetically based. Again, I love catechesis, but that's not the only part of Catholicism, catechesis.
Yeah, it's interesting that it does speak not only to our soul and to our minds, to our hearts, but it really addresses all the different senses.
That's right.
So it draws us in. So can you explain a little bit, like how does the traditional Mass speak to all the different senses? Like, can you run through that a little bit?
Do you want me to give it from the point of view of a priest like me at the Solemn High Mass, or let's talk Solemn High Mass because that's even better. Do you want me to give it from the point of view of a priest or a lay person like yourself?
I think a lay person would be good, helpful for our audience.
Yeah. So a lot of naysayers against tradition will say, well, all that incense was used because people in the Middle Ages stunk to high heaven and you needed incense because they smelled that. Well, there's a little truth to that. Well, here's the thing. There's actually a little truth to that. But who cares if that was the case? Like that let's say everyone smelled like cattle coming. I don't even think that was the case. I think a lot of the theories of the medieval ages were wrong. I saw a little thing even on a secular thing on Twitter the other day. It was like medieval people actually took showers. Even they didn't look like our showers, but their hygiene was 1,000 times better than we actually project onto the Middle Ages. But let's pretend for a minute like they all smelled to high heaven, right? When
Right.
they walked into Mass, like, even if you did all smell like cattle all day, the glories of what entered your nose as Mass started with the incense, they say that smell is closest to memory. Everyone who studied neurology and brain structure says that the sense of smell is closest to memory. Through the incense entering your nose, as you first enter there, whether you were smelling nice things or bad things right before that, your mind is brought to heaven by the inhalation of this incense. And this wasn't just once again, this was not invented in the 12th century. This is right out of the book of the Apocalypse, that the incense, in fact, it goes to the Old Testament, it goes to the book of the Apocalypse, that incense is like prayer rising to God. So the incense is actually literally a prayer, and we are being raised by that beautiful smelling incense as the thurifer walks in at the solemn high mass, and you breathe. There's even something pacifying. They've even showed chemically there's something pacifying about incense, and I've noticed that in my life.
Yeah.
I have a lot of inflammation problems, so like everything immediately crosses my blood-brain barrier, and so I'm affected more rapidly than most people. When I smell incense at Mass, I'm pacified and brought to a level of peace pretty quickly, actually.
It's
So
interesting.
that's the first step, right?
It's interesting. Yeah. That's good. And then what about the rest? The other
Yeah,
side?
and then think about Gregorian chant. This is truly it's heavenly music, and even Sacrosanctum Concilium, which I'm not even a huge fan of, admits that, and that was a post-Vatican II document, admits this is the Roman Rites music. But if you study how it came about, Pope St. Gregory the Great, St. Benedict, they conglomerated a lot of that in the 5th and 6th century, but it's older than that. And so once again, there's something apostolic in it. There's something angelic in Gregorian chant. And when you realize there's something Gregorian or angelic in Gregorian chant, this isn't just like, well, I like Gregorian chant because it's older than the, Oregon Catholic Press book or something like that. No, there's something actually heavenly and angelic about it. And so your sound, your hearing rather, is now raised to heaven as the solemn high mass starts. So now we have smell and hearing literally raising us to heaven. And what do we know the Mass is? What's a participation in three things: past, present, future. Past, you're brought to Calvary. Present, you're in the representation of the Last Supper. And future, you are brought to heaven in Holy Mass. All three of those are true at the exact same time. And so now we have at the very beginning of Mass, you are brought to heaven by your hearing and by your smell. How about sight? Well, I would say the structure of what you see in the Solemn High Mass, think of like the introit, how they're angled like an arrow, how they have to go up the stairs, both the bishop and the priest and the subdeacon, or the priest and deacon and subdeacon, the way they go up the stairs, there's something heavenly. You are seeing people in otherworldly garments walk up to heaven. They're not just, walking around the sacristy cracking jokes in their Bronco stole or whatever else. You are watching men who are celibate, and there is a connection between celibacy and the angelic state right out of Luke chapter 20. Now you're seeing three celibates, at least, well, yeah, actually all three celibates, because subdeacon was required to be fully celibate too, walk up the stairs. They're walking up to heaven. So everything is being raised. And then look at how the medieval cathedrals, and even the cathedrals from the first millennium of Catholicism, were made. Everything is directed above. So your eyes are now being brought up. And I don't mean just figuratively up. They're being brought literally up.
Yeah, didn't they call it the high altar? They called it the high altar for a reason, because it's the pinnacle point. Wow.
Yeah, it pulls your eyes up. It's almost you can go to like Notre Dame in France, and you'll see secularists who are in their tight jeans and phones out and stuff, and even they can't help but have their eyes. There's just something automatic.
It's
how
true.
your eyes are brought up above the high altar.
Yeah, pointing always to that, to the heavenly. Yeah, that's amazing. So good. And then touch. How is that? How is that in Mass?
So touch would be how we sit, stand, and kneel. Again, I mentioned earlier how comedians like to make fun of Catholics for all the sit, stand, and kneel stuff, but we worship God in our body. And I mean, a lot of the Novus Ordos maintain a lot of those positions, but by sitting, standing, and kneeling, we worship God through these things. So when we kneel, that is an act of adoration. When people say, I don't really like to kneel after the Sanctus, God's our friend, I'm going to keep standing, there's something satanic about that. I know that sounds like an exaggeration to come out of left field with a word like satanic, but what did Satan say? He said, non serviam, I will not serve. So now I understand. I'm not saying that people who have, broken knees or have to stand to receive communion because they're,
something
they have
different.
physical problems. I'm not calling them satanic, right? I'm saying the people who say, I will not kneel for the consecration, I will not kneel for the representation of Calvary on the altar. Well, there's something satanic about that because Satan will not serve. So when we kneel for the consecration, most people are, 99% of the people are doing that as an act of adoration. Or even if your mind wanders, you deciding to go to Mass to kneel with your body, with the sense of touch, you are worshiping the triune God.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And it really brings you back into, the right mindset, I think. I think kneeling really helps you to focus on what is it that you're there for, because we're human, we get distracted, this and that. So the gestures really, really help bring us back into that mystery of what's going on at the Mass.
Yeah.
So excellent. That's really good. So thank you for going.
And of course, taste would be receiving our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. But anytime before the 19th century, you would have seen most Catholics valued quality over quantity. Many of your listeners probably know that the precepts of the Church is only to receive once a year. But very few Catholics were doing, most Catholics before Pope Pius X, and I like the fact he encouraged people to receive more. He certainly didn't see the pendulum was going to swing so far to the other side. But before Pius X, your average really good Catholic would have only received Holy Communion maybe 10 times a year. Even like St. Therese would have received communion 10 times a year. Again, I'm happy Pope Pius X increased that, but Catholics in the past really valued quality of reception over quantity. And that's where before about 1920, do you know the only person that received at a low Mass was the priest himself? And at a high Mass, it would have just been like the major orders that received. Lay people, the very few lay people that would have come forward to receive Holy Communion before 1920, they only receive communion after Mass. In fact, you can see that in Norcia. I was out in Norcia about 3 weeks ago, and they have a solemn high Mass every day. And when the lay people receive, it's literally after Mass. It's not during Mass. So they've kept some very, very old traditions out in Norcia right there. And that kind of does teach people that it doesn't have to be normative to receive communion at every Mass. Again, it normally happened after the Mass, not during the Mass. And then we do have these great saints. Look at St. Mary of Egypt. She's one of my favorite saints, and she is claimed by both East and West. But she was probably the holiest woman in the 4th century, reading hearts, walking on water, working miracles, and she received communion her whole life a total of 2 times. Wow. So once again, it's all about quality over quantity. And if you read the story of her life as told by St. Zosimus, another saint, and you can really trust saint stories when it's told by another saint, you can see that reception of communion was pinnacle in her life. Like, I'm not downplaying Holy Communion. I mean, those were like the 2 greatest moments of her life, besides probably when she went to confession for all of her unbelievable sins. So those 2 times she received was a huge part of the story, but she only received twice, and she was working miracles before, between, and after those 2 tremendously supersonic receptions of Holy Communion. So better to have supersonic receptions of Holy Communion than frequent shallow reception, even if you're in grace.
It's true. It's true, because I think it was I think, if I'm right, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was Saint de Sales, Francis de Sales, who said that just one Holy Communion done well is enough to make you a saint.
I think St. Teresa of Avila says that too.
Yeah, so it's amazing. So it's on us. I think so many saints talk about that too. It's on us to try to prepare the best we can for Holy Communion to be able to receive Him well. So
and to make a good Thanksgiving, there's that story of St. Philip Neri saw a woman receive communion and didn't make a Thanksgiving, and so he sent his 2 altar servers after her to walk into the streets of Rome with the candles next to her because the Blessed Sacrament was still in her. So it had a twofold thing. It was to accompany our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament because she hadn't digested Him yet, And it was to embarrass her as well. He should have, to show her, if you're going to dare receive the Son of God and not make a Thanksgiving, here's a little penance. He liked to do the penances that ripped on people's egos more than physically. So it had a twofold thing. He literally had the altar service accompanying the Blessed Sacrament through the streets of Rome. But, you know, hopefully she never made another shallow communion after he rightly embarrassed her a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I had a priest friend. He put up a sign at the front of the church, and this is down in Florida, and he it said, I think something along the lines, Judas was the first to leave the Last Supper.
Yeah, the Judas shuffle, as they call it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's good. That's good reminders. So another question we have here is, why would you die for the Holy Mass?
Would I die? Yeah, I would die for the Holy Mass. You know, there's that famous story of Fulton Sheen and the little 10 or 12-year-old Chinese girl. Probably your listeners all know that story.
I don't think everyone. Yeah, go ahead and explain it. I don't know if they all know it.
There's a couple details I'm going to get wrong. The guys at Mass of the Ages are working on making this into a movie. I hope that's not wrong for me to spoil that yet. Hopefully this is like a preview of their upcoming movie and I didn't ruin anything. But someone once asked Archbishop Fulton Sheen, why do you make the daily holy hour? Who is your inspiration? A priest, a bishop? He said, a little girl in China. And they said, what do you mean a little girl in China? And I'm going to get a couple of these details wrong. But basically, in the Chinese communist government, they had come into a Catholic church, I think in the 1970s, and they caused these communist soldiers came in, caused a bunch of violence, and a bunch of people left. They hit the tabernacle with the butt of the rifle, and like 30 hosts came out. Maybe they killed some people. They imprisoned the priest in the sacristy, like in a cage or something like that. And then they kind of guarded this church, but they missed the fact there was this like 12 or 13-year-old girl in there. And even though this was just after Vatican II and she could have touched the Eucharist with her hands, she didn't. Maybe it was before Vatican II, but anyway, it was right 50s, 60s, 70s. Mm-hmm. Somehow she knew not to touch the Eucharist with her hands, but she also believed she could only receive maximum once a day. And so what she decided to do, because there was 30 hosts on the ground, is she made basically like 20 holy hours a day in front of these, and only received on her knees, receiving the host on her tongue. So she'd have to go down, put her tongue on the ground to receive a host every day. And there's, again, about 30 hosts. So she's staying in there, basically vigiling without sleep, certainly going without food and water, all to adore our Lord 20-something hours a day for that single reception of Jesus in the Eucharist. And then on the very last day, when she's licking up the very final host, one of the communist guards sees her and kills her. And so, I mean, I can never even tell that story without getting choked up, you know? That's how we should all be to the Holy Mass right there. And so this priest saw that, and he's the one who told Fulton Sheen that story. And Fulton Sheen, who'd kind of like demurred about making a daily holy hour, when he heard that story, he said, that's it. If she can do 20 holy hours a day before death, I have no excuse not to make a holy hour before the Blessed Sacrament. And so that's when he decided to make the daily holy hour an absolute, even if he was traveling.
Yeah, and she risked her life. She probably knew this.
And she gave her life. She was killed for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you would do the same.
Yes. Yes. I mean, you know, there's the stories in St. Alphonsus Liguori's Victories of the Martyrs where one guy thought he could do it, and he was not calling on Jesus and Mary through the torture, and he failed. He cracked under the torture. So I say I could do it, but I could only really say I could do it by God's grace. So I might be screaming like a child. Hopefully those words would be screaming for Jesus and Mary, but I guess I should reform my answer. I would do it by the grace of God. I would be happy to die for the Holy Mass.
And
but
why?
Even then, you know, claiming I'm some intense priest about it doesn't mean I would actually power through torture at the Mass unless God gave me the grace. So
sure,
I ask God for the grace, if that day ever came, to die for him as he died for me.
Perfect. Very good. And another one is, this one I think would be very useful for souls listening, is there's so much, I call it massive diabolical disorientation and confusion. And so you've been leading souls on your YouTube channel, in particular through the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius. And using some of his rules, how would you encourage people to get through this confusion, especially in particular in this sense, of determining whether one should go to the traditional Latin Mass and leave the Novus Ordo? Because right now we have a lot of souls who are really seeking and desiring to get holy and to get away from some of this diabolical chaos. And some of them are struggling as to what to do. And some of them see it. I mean, even priests, we even have priests that sometimes contact us and say, I'm thinking of leaving and just doing the traditional Mass, but I'm torn and I don't know how to discern. And I think this St. Ignatius and his rules will help here. And I don't know if you can explain what you think about that.
Yes. Thanks for listening, first of all. And yes, I do have a new series on my show, Padre Peregrino. It's called Peregrino Ignatian Pathways, and people can hear it on Apple or Spotify. Sometimes it's easier on YouTube because even though there's a bunch of problems with YouTube as far as politically, the nice thing is they have playlists, meaning you can tap the playlist and then hit. You can listen from the beginning episode to the final episode under that specific playlist. So you can hear Peregrino Ignatian Pathway 1, and then that goes to PIP. I call it PIP 2, and then PIP 3, and then PIP. So you can listen straight through from the first to the last if people wanted to. And I think we're on like the 6th or 7th podcast right now. Okay, so in the very first 3 of the PIP, we give the intro, and in that we see that St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, even though a lot of people, even traditionalists, sometimes think the Jesuits were rotten from the start, they most certainly were not. And one of the very first rules that Ignatius gives us for thinking with the Orthodox faith, he means the Catholic faith, it's rule number 11 on having the Catholic Orthodox faith, is to think in union with the Church Fathers. And he actually names some of them. St. Augustine, then he even talks about later saints, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure. He basically says, before you jump into discernment of spirits, what you think about what God's calling in your life, the very first thing you need to look to is the Christ, the apostle. Because, I mean, he was at the time of the Protestant revolt. So he couldn't just say, just follow Jesus. You'll hear a lot of priests even say that. Well, should I go to the new Mass or the old Mass? Well, just go ask Jesus about it. Okay, that's a fine answer. The problem is that's the answer the Protestants gave in the 16th century. And so you have to be more specific. I mean, ultimately that is the right answer. You have to ask Jesus. But we have guides to Christ through the people that were at the unitive stage of prayer, the very highest levels of prayer, not just getting private revelations, but the people who were informed by God how to interpret the apostles. And the church has said that anytime the church fathers speak unanimously on something, it's actually infallible. That's right in Vatican I. When the church fathers speak unanimously on something, it's infallible. And so St. Ignatius of Loyola, he says, before you jump into these decisions, he calls it the election of your life, you want to really be thinking with the church fathers. And so that's really going to be my own. I know you're probably on the edge of your seat for me to explain why people should go to the traditional Mass. I'm actually not going to tell people to do that because I do believe following the church fathers has to be the very first part. And I think if you're really serious about that, you are going to be led to exclusively the old sacraments because that's all they did. Even the Eastern fathers would have done very ancient divine liturgies. But the other reason I'm not going to tell people exactly what to do is because one of the things that is in that series that I'm putting out there is if you're thinking with the Orthodox rules and you're really living in sanctifying grace, God does give you a pretty wide berth of freedom on these things, provided you're not sinning, you're not going against the church's teaching. Now, some people would say, well, the Novus Ordo in and of itself is against the Catholic Church's history. But I mean, to be perfectly honest, like I've talked to people who really don't have access to the traditional Latin Mass, and they found some Novus Ordo priest who was very charitable and he's trying to do his very best. And I know one family had a bunch of traumatic experiences at the Latin Mass, and they found an African priest in southern Colorado, and there's a very traditional family, and they have really connected with his charity, and they're kind of getting a little, bit of this trad detox. And I'm the last person in the world that's going to give credit to like the people talking about trad detox, because I don't even believe most of the stories. But 1% of those stories are true. And it sounds like she's actually doing genuine discernment of spirits. Well, part of it's they can't go, 4 hours in the car every day. Mm-hmm. But that's like an example of people that are doing good discernment of spirits and somehow going to the Novus Ordo. I think that's very, very, very rare. But these are very complex times. And so this is why I do think discernment of spirits is, to be perfectly honest, I think 99 to 100% of the time, if you're doing the right discernment of spirits, you are going to be led to the old sacraments. But I've heard some kind of rare exceptions. I have a friend, and her son has autism, and they have to be in the sacristy, and that just works better for the Novus Ordo, for that family, because he's nonverbal with his autism. And there's some things I won't get into on the podcast that work out there, but that's a very rare case where it just works better for them to go to the Novus Ordo. So discernment of spirits really brings in a lot of life experience, provided the backdrop is the tradition of the church. So yeah, most of the time you're going to be led to the old sacraments, but sometimes people have some deep wounds. There's a lot of whininess out there, but some people have real wounds and might.
And that's what I think St. Ignatius would help with, if you use his rules of discernment of spirits, that it could help lead you through this massive.
I think so. Yeah. And I even talk about things like the C19 mRNA rearranger. I don't know if you're putting this on which hosts are going to be putting it. We have to watch out for some of the words, but like that whole thing is going to guide you through a lot of life decisions, really. And one of the main things is you're supposed to look at the evidence before your feelings on all of these decisions. So if you're going to apply discernment of spirits to which mass to go to, look at the evidence of where are the vocations coming out of that parish? How are the marriages? How many of these people take the Catholic faith seriously? What is your priest like? And so look at the evidence of your priest and the family's spiritual life and things, not in a judgmental way, but like, are they really living the faith? Those pieces of evidence actually matter more than your feelings about one of the two masses.
The fruits, not the feelings. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Excellent. So a question, this one is, I guess, in relation to the terrible news that we had with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And there's been debate going on now on both social media and in person, just people asking, a lot of people loved Charlie. He was a great conservative and so forth. But they don't know, as Catholics, how to, so I guess the debate right now is, was he a Catholic or was he not? And some people are saying, well, he might have been a catechumen, he might have not been, he's an evangelical, etc. Yeah. So that sets it up. But then the question becomes, apparently in tradition, if you die as a non-Catholic, you can't have a mass offered. Mm-hmm. You can't offer mass for non-Catholics, but only while they're living for their conversion. So, what is the, if you can just kind of help with some of this debate that's going on. Can we offer a mass for Charlie Kirk? Can we not? What can we do in this case, in this tragic thing, and offering prayers and doing what we can as Catholics?
Yes. So I have friends who are 1958 Sedevacantists. Other groups of 58 Sedevacantists only present certain parts of the faith. I'll give you one example. I won't name their name because I want them to come after me, but they have a whole thing on why Catholics, you can't offer a public mass for, well, here's what they say. You can't offer a mass for a deceased non-Catholic. And they quote the 1903 Catholic Encyclopedia, pretty solid document, right? And so I went and looked at that because, again, they claim 1903 Catholic Encyclopedia says you cannot offer a mass for a deceased non-Catholic. Mm-hmm. Here's this specific group of 58 studies are kind of funny. They're always in error through what they leave out, not what they actually present. So here's what they left out of that. The 1903 Catholic Encyclopedia does in fact say you can't offer a public mass for a deceased non-Catholic, but you can offer private masses for deceased non-Catholics. And so the altar behind me, I've already offered a couple masses for Charlie Kirk. As I put on Substack, I can't declare him a martyr. So I'm still obliged to pray for him. But because he never formally entered the church, you really can't do, like, according to the traditional rules, a public mass for a fallen non-Catholic. But I'm a hermit. I live alone, and according to the old school rules, I can offer private masses for him. And so, obviously, if God saw him as a martyr and he went straight to heaven, God's going to redirect those prayers of my mass there. If somehow he's not saved, I don't think that's the case. If somehow he's not saved, my prayers are still going to get redirected to people in purgatory. So that's kind of one of those things where I'm really glad you asked the question, because there's a lot of information out there, and it often takes some digging past the initial traditional presentation. Because again, the traditional presentation is you can't offer mass for a non-Catholic who died. And again, the old school rules is that is the case for public masses, but there is some leeway on private masses.
Private masses. No, that's good. That's really good to hear. So if Catholics want to ask their, local priest, can you offer a mass? They could do it privately, and there's no.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then there's, I think one of the important things to realize is, I put this on Substack, that the Catholic Church traditionally considered her catechumens to be one of her own. Now, the pushback I got from a lot of traditionalists was, but he hadn't entered RCIA. And what I want to say to those traditionalists is, but do you really believe in RCIA? Like, do you really think that the real test of if you're a catechumen is if you go to Mrs. O'Sullivan's liberal class in the basement eating cookies and learning about social justice? Like, you have a guy quoting scripture, defending the rights of Mary, sounding more Catholic, sorry to say it, than 99.9% of the bishops in the United States. And you're going to say, unless you're in union with the bishops who you sound a lot more Catholic than, then you can't be saved. I mean, so this really brings into questions of, like, what do you mean by the Catholic Church, right? And do you have to be in union with the very bishops that publicly declare all the time that Protestants are saved, which I disagree with? I'm not saying those bishops are right, but you see how it's kind of like a weird cyclical thing that neither the Recognize and Resist or the 58 Settings have fully figured out, because it's like the Recognize and Resist non-Setties out there who are saying Charlie Kirk's in hell because he didn't enter formally the Catholic Church before he died. They're really saying he didn't unify with a Pachamama worshiping and his predecessor, the next guy in line with him, and the U.S. bishops who are totally fine with their Catholics double dipping on Sundays, going to a mega church and Holy Mass. So I don't understand personally how you have to say Charlie Kirk had to be in union with the local bishop who really doesn't believe in hell. Let's just be very honest. I don't think there's a single ordinary in the United States that believes anyone goes to hell. And Charlie Kirk really believed people went to hell. So you're going to have some listeners not very happy at my next sentence, but he was more Catholic than 99% of the Catholics out there. Because I'll be honest, modernism is actually a worse heresy than Eastern Orthodoxy. It's a worse heresy than Protestantism. And now when I say modernism, most people think, yeah, James Martin's really bad. No. I'm actually more extreme than your average traditionalist. I think 99% of the Catholics in this country are actually modernists. So if Charlie Kirk's not saved for not being a Catholic, then really nobody going to the Novus Ordo is going to be saved either. So you got to be pretty careful of the conclusions you come to on this stuff.
Yeah, but I think it's true. I think it's a good point you're making, because what does being in union with the church or in union with the faith or in communion with Christ really? I mean, we have lots of debate going on with that, like the SSPX are not in communion with the church or whatever, this group isn't, that group isn't, or that priest isn't. Even independent priests get picked on, they're not in communion with the church, they're not under a bishop, and so forth. But one person I says, it goes back to what St. Paul says, where we have to be of one heart, one mind, one baptism, one faith. And what does that look like? It looks like, holding faithful to the dogmas and the doctrines of the church that have always been, always were, and were taught everywhere. Right. And holding to that.
And even I've written a lot against moral theology errors that just overemphasize reduced culpability, but we as traditionalists do believe in a little bit of reduced culpability. And Dr. Maz has proven, I went looking through Charlie Kirk's old tweets, even before I knew you were going to ask me this question today, And Charlie Kirk wanted to enter the Catholic Church, but he saw in Francis such a Marxist, he couldn't do it. When I heard Dr. Mazza say that on Ann Barnhart's podcast just 2 days ago, I decided this morning, again, before you even had me on to talk about this, I went looking through Charlie Kirk's tweets, and it's true. He was highlighting, he was trying to stay very respectful of the Catholics he could, but he couldn't enter because he saw in him a Marxist. And boy, regardless of where you find that man's validity on the chair of Peter, you have to grant some slack to Charlie Kirk, a very Bible-believing Christian, who that has to be some cause for reduced culpability. If looking at a Universalist, Unitarian, Pachamama worshiper, you can't enter that church. Unless you're in union with a Pachamama worshiper, you're not saved. That cannot be how the God of divine revelation functions. I'm not saying I know he's absolutely in heaven, but there's holes in a lot of traditional arguments out there right now, and I just don't buy it. Unless Charlie Kirk died in union with 2 open border popes, he can't be saved, as he, died for defending the truth. The measure, and I'll just, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's sad, the situation that we're in. It's like it has to be like a miracle. And it really is, because we've had a catechumen just recently this past year join the church, and we consider it a huge miracle, because they look at the Pope and they're like, and I tell my kids in class, I said, we're not Catholic because of the Pope. He's supposed to be representing Christ, supposed to be defending the doctrine of the church, but when he's not, and he's gone off the rails, we don't follow that way. We continue to just remain faithful, but and that's what being communion really means. It doesn't mean you have to follow the Pachamama way, etc. It's really a miracle if someone does enter the church today. It's heartbreaking to see how much even just as Catholics, how do we hold on, seeing, that the hierarchy is and such, but Our Lady has warned us that would happen.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And like you look at, there were some Eastern Orthodox metropolitans even over the last 50 years who wanted to become Catholic, and the Vatican, I think it was in the 1980s, maybe the 1990s also, so we're even talking prior to 2013, told them, don't become Catholic. They wanted to become Eastern Catholics. And I don't know if it was a patriarch or an Eastern Orthodox bishop, and they were told by the Vatican, don't convert, because that's going to harm ecumenical relations. So the really tough recognize and resist people out there who say, well, Eastern Orthodox or schismatic, they're gonna go to hell. It's like, so they're gonna go to hell for obeying the very Vatican they have to be in union with by obeying them who tells them to stay out of the Catholic Church. That doesn't make any sense, right? So again, I'm not saying they're saved because times are confusing, but I am saying there's got to be major levels of reduced culpability in God's mercy if you have an Eastern Orthodox patriarch wanting to become Catholic and the Vatican itself tells him, no, you stay Eastern Orthodox because that's going to hurt Eastern Orthodox relations. That is not us teaching the classic teaching of extra ecclesia nulla salus, right? And then in that case, maybe the 58 Sedes are right, but then in that case, was Charlie Kirk, did he go to hell for not being in union with a church totally invisible, a church that has absolutely no visibility? Well, that also doesn't describe a merciful God either. So everyone who thinks they have a really good answer, from like the tough guy recognizing resistors to the 58 Sedes, don't have it. And I don't claim I have it either. That's where I'm just remembering the measure with which you measure is going to be measured unto you. And Charlie Kirk was more Catholic than 99% of the Catholics I know. So, if he's not saved, I better go live in a cave on 1 potato a day, which I probably should do as a hermit anyway for my own salvation.
No, that's good. So thank you for going through all that, Father. One last question that's hot from our subscribers who were talking about this and wanting to get your advice. They want to know, what is the proper Catholic understanding in the current debate on adopting IVF embryos? So apparently there was an article, even on LifeSite News, for and against this. Mm-hmm. So a lot of Catholics are talking about this. Is it really a good thing to do this, to try to save the IVF embryos that are in stasis right now as a way of adopting them and saving them? Or is it participating in the evil, so forth? What should be the proper understanding?
I think that's one of the very few good bioethical questions out there that actually has two good answers. Like a lot of the things people are debating are not debatable. That's actually a debatable topic, I think, because when people, okay, so obviously there's the yuck factor of the whole thing. It does seem very strange for a non-mother to say, I'm going to do embryo adoption by having this embryo put into my body. And that does seem to be, just by our emotions, by what I call the yuck factor, very much against Catholic teaching. But if we admit that the young woman who wants to do the embryo rescue, you're talking about embryo rescue, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
The young woman who wants to do embryo rescue, if we admit that really isn't replacing the marital act because that's already taken place, even if it was in an artificial manner in a test tube, well, then you can say, well, as long as you can admit that the marital act was already replaced in a sinful way before she came along, maybe she can do it. That's kind of where I was believing up till about 2 years ago. But Dr. Taylor Marshall kind of put me over the edge to say, no, it actually is partially a replacement of the marital act, even though fertilization has already taken place. So I think that's the first reason I'm against it right now. I'm not, I don't think the people arguing for it are the most horrible people in bioethics, because there are some very good arguments for embryo rescue. But ultimately, I do come down on the side of probably being against it, again, because even the rescue part is mildly a replacement of the marital act. And then there's a real practical problem with the whole thing is a lot of these IVF clinics, they don't only charge for the women freezing their own children, they also charge for the people coming to put these embryos in their bodies, even if it's for embryo rescue. The people making millions of dollars at IVF clinics, they don't care that it's like some poor pro-life Catholic single woman who thinks she's doing embryo rescue rather. Mm-hmm. And so she has to pay too. So what does that mean? That means it's feeding the market. So I think my number one reason against embryo rescue is you're feeding the market and you're telling these horrible places that are literally freezing children, you can keep doing that. I'll keep coming and paying you to put these in my body. And then what you have is this continued cycle that not only are the people freezing their children having to pay for cryogenic freezing, but the people, quote unquote, doing embryo rescue also have to rescue. So I don't know a lot about economics, but that really seems to be an invitation to feed the market for embryos.
Right. No, it makes sense. And it's a horrible, evil market that's going on out there. And I think, that's why there's the discussion on like how to end. Yeah. It's better just to end it than, be the best.
And then what do you do? I mean, what do they say? There's several 100,000 frozen children in this country. Maybe it's in the millions by now, but I know it's at least 100,000 or 200,000 frozen children. Do you just go in there and spray holy water and baptize them? Like, what is? I don't know. We've never had times in all of history like this, so I don't know the right answer.
Yeah, I've heard that talked about too. So, well, good. Well, thank you so much for that, Father. Can you end us in a prayer?
Sure. Maybe we'll just do the Our Father. I'll do the first half. You can do the second half.
Sure.
Okay. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum. Adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
In panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut nos dimitibus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Amen. Our Lady of Sorrows,
pray for us.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Thanks for having me.